All right. Well, hello and welcome to the second of three workshops in the Ways of Repair, Loss and Damage public program. My name is Lena Dobrowolska and I am one of the coordinators of the Ways of Repair, and I will be the moderator of today's discussion, Understanding and Addressing Loss and Damage to Culture and Identity, a primer for artists. Thank you very much for joining us today. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, Ways of Repair, Loss and Damage is an online artistic research residency, a series of public events, and a set of commissioned critical texts aimed at facilitating a transdisciplinary exchange around the issue of loss and damage caused by the climate crisis. The program is part of the Loss and Damage Collaborations Art and Cultural Program and is supported by the Open Society Foundations. In November last year, we've launched a global call-out for the Artists in Residence program, which is a year-long research opportunity that supports artists' research time to develop a new body of work or a new line of inquiry relating to the issue of loss and damage. We received over 740 applications, and we were very pleased to have welcomed Gabriela de Matos, Nombuso Matibela, and Sibonello Gumede, as well as Zara Malkani as artists in residence to the program. You can find out about the research proposal on our website under the residency section. In March, we announced the following critical thinkers who will be developing texts of repair. It's Alexis Pauline Gams, Dr. Farhana Sultana, and TJ Demos. The commissioned texts of repair are intended to provide conceptual frameworks and critical links between the loss and damage discourse and themes already being widely explored within the arts and humanities in response to the combined climate, human rights, and environmental crises, and the drive towards decolonization. To find the full bios of each critical thinkers and the summary of the proposals, head to Text of Repair tab on our website. So in today's webinar, we are going to be exploring how the climate crisis is causing loss and damage to culture, identity, sense of place, heritage, ways of knowing and being, and the importance of bringing pluralistic ways of knowing to the loss and damage discourse in the conversation with our esteemed speakers, Andrea Carmen and Dr. Robert Albro. And before I will introduce our speakers, I wanted to underscore that the issue of the loss of traditional knowledge and cultural identity should be treated with utmost seriousness and ethical sensitivity. Indigenous peoples make up less than 5% of the global population, yet protect 80% of Earth's remaining biodiversity, underscoring the vital role that the protection and support of Indigenous people and their unique knowledge systems associated with them technologies and cultural practices play in solving the issue of the climate crisis. Furthermore, climate change already poses existential level threats and dangers to the survival of Indigenous communities worldwide, even though Indigenous peoples contributed the least to greenhouse emissions. We wanted to appeal to the audience to acknowledge the emotional burden of speaking about loss, especially for those whose communities have been directly and continuously impacted, acknowledging the historical links of climate change to colonialism and extractivism by these issues, and to express our gratitude for their generosity in sharing their knowledge, as well as to appeal to those who are listening to ethically consider their questions, as well as to take care when thinking about these issues as they come with an emotional toll. So without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce the speakers and allow them to say a few words before launching into keynote presentations. Andrea Carmen, Yaqui Nation, is the Executive Director of the International Indian Treaty Council. Andrea, do you want to say hello?
Hello, and thank you. And thanks to the organizers for this very interesting dialogue that we're going to have today.
Thank you. And Dr. Robert Albro, who's a sociocultural anthropologist and research associate professor at the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at the American University in Washington, D.C.
Hi, yes. Fantastic to be here. Just echoing Andrea and saying that I find this a very interesting and timely conversation and look forward to participating in it.
Thank you very much. We are, again, incredibly grateful to have you both with us today. And just very quickly, before we get going, I would like to introduce a couple of house rules. As you can see, this webinar is being recorded and will be hosted on the Ways of Repair website. Attendees can ask questions. Please type your question into the Q&A box, and where possible, we will integrate them into the discussion that will happen after the presentations. In case you were wondering if there was a glitch, no, we are going to be floating heads today, so you can see all of us at the same time, as well as the background. On the screen behind us, you will see speakers' presentations, as well as slideshow of images in our discussion section of this webinar. And this is intended to steer conversation, but not necessarily illustrate what is being talked about. The slides will be shared with the recording of the webinar, so you can read the captions and find out more about them. So without further delay, I would like now to give the floor to Dr. Robert Albro.
Thank you, Lena. So I should say, just as a preface, that my contribution here comes at the intersection, if you will, of climate change or climate policy with cultural policy. And so when thinking about questions of loss and damage, I'm particularly interested in the ways in which loss and damage frameworks, normative, international, multilateral, are driving ideas about specifically cultural heritage and what some of the consequences of that process might look like. So that said, the first, next slide. So this slide and the one following it, give them a second to look at that, and then we can just go to the next one real quick. You might recognize the artist. This is a well-known environmental artist, Alexis Rockman. The first slide was a Gowanus, which refers to a canal in Brooklyn, New York, one of the most polluted waterways in the world, and designated as Superfund cleanup site by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And the second slide, also in New York, is, I guess you could call it the sort of the arc of climate in Central Park, from glaciation or the period of the last ice age, perhaps, to, and it's ambiguous, but maybe a post-human tropical paradise, at least for birds. I'm not trying to dwell on the environmental art or art practice, but briefly, art, especially visual art, has had a long-standing, complex, and rich relationship to environmental movements in the US and globally, as we know. The many developments are too varied for me to review here, but the two Rockman paintings, let's just think of them as tokens, if you will, of the well-established communicational and diplomatic role of much environmental art, particularly with respect to climate change. So by diplomatic, I mean artistic outreach to help publics visualize, narrativize, dramatize the climate crisis in one way, shape, or form, to charge the imagination as a spur to action. In a typically dystopian gesture, I would say, Rockman here paints human beings, though not the impacts of humanity, out of Earth's climate future. Next slide. So quickly, a couple other examples of visual art, now shifting from, let's call it, dystopian futures to utopian futures, or kind of the note of climate optimism. This first is an unknown artist. There's no date, but it's, as you can see, maybe not the greatest art, but it's a sort of a representation of a future city with renewable energy and green design and biophilic vertical architecture, green roofs, flourishing ecosystems, humans as part of this ecosystem, but as a less extractive and more sustainable factor. Next slide. Yep. And similarly, again, an optimistic account. These kinds of artistic interventions in public discussions around climate change are already doubtless familiar to us, but I want to start here just really quickly because they also represent one prevalent way that international cultural policymakers imagine cultural producers and cultural production and the ways in which they should be, according to the policymaking universe, contributing to mobilizing efforts to account for and encourage forms of climate adaptation and resilience, right? Offering optimistic appraisals and solutions and ways forward amid the climate crisis. But what I want to point out is that in the rush for solutions and in the effort to position cultural policy in this way, our attention is being directed away from questions of loss, questions of cultural loss. Next slide. So this is you might have seen something like this before. This is a photo of, from above, of Gardi Sugdub, which is a Guna community, part of the Guna Yala off the coast of Panama, approximately 2,000 or so people who will be needing to relocate to the Panamanian mainland in the near future due to sea level rise. At Gardi Sugdub, this community here, as you can see, already severely affected by the possibility of sea level rise, which is already happening, has been actually planning to move for over a decade. Both the Panamanian government and international development actors are in fact currently building single-family homes, a school, health or medical facility on the nearby mainland. All material community assets. But what are the Guna themselves worried about? One of the things that they've been raising and that they talk about in conjunction with the need for houses and similar kinds of material infrastructure is the question of the long-term cultural integrity of their community. They're particularly concerned with their social relationship with the sea, considered an ancestor, which is going to change as they move to the mainland. They're concerned about traditions of collective decision-making and the ways in which those traditions of decision-making depend upon the vitality of intergenerational networks between younger and elder Guna, which are sort of the underpinnings that support community cohesion for Guna. And one of the things that Guna elders have pointed out is the problem of the single-family homes being built in anticipation of their arrival on the mainland. These are designed to accommodate nuclear families, but Guna, at least as they live in Gardi Sugdub, tend to live in extended family units. And one of the things that the Guna are concerned about is that there will no longer be regular contact between different generational parts of their community. And that, for them, is absolutely critical. So this is just a quick example, but we can see the different importance attributed to, on the one hand, potential material needs on the part of the government and development workers, and then intangible losses that the Guna are giving voice to, but also the evident neglect of the latter by the authorities in charge of developing the Guna's new home. Next slide. So this is probably a familiar layout for you. This the UNFCCC's loss and damage framework. It quickly seeks to communicate the differences between so-called economic and non-economic losses. So on the one hand, on the left there, we have a series of tangible and material assets, typically infrastructure, buildings, bridges, roads, that kind of thing, that can be counted and for which an economic value can be calculated. That's extremely important. I want to underline that. Much of what is happening in the loss and damage space depends upon the extent to which one can determine the value of loss as a result of transforming those losses into economically legible terms. On the other hand, on the other side, you see a list of things, including categories like life, health, mobility, territory, biodiversity, ecosystem services, indigenous knowledge, cultural heritage. I'd like to draw attention to the way in which this is a set of very unlike things. It's not clear to me, at least, why we would have all of these grouped together in this way. Certainly some of these things, for example, ecosystem services, are routinely given an economic value and are traded right now in the marketplace. In the UN context, I want to suggest non-economic loss is, at least to this point, heavily under-theorized. And as described, I think it's an incoherent concept. Overwhelmingly, efforts to understand non-economic losses also seek to make them countable and legible in economic terms, despite the fact that they're ostensibly non-economic losses. Next slide. It's a similar breakdown, just giving you a sense of where attention to non-economic loss is located. What I've mainly been focusing on in my work and I'm focusing on here is the combination, the bottom left square in the 4x4 of non-economic and non-material loss. But again, you see here, there's some questions to ask. One has to do with, here we have non-economic, non-material, so loss of identity, loss of knowledge, loss of social cohesion, but territory is, at least insofar as I'm aware, quite material in a fundamental sense. And so why it isn't perhaps above rather than below is unclear to me. But again, this just speaks to the relative incoherence of this concept as we're being asked to adopt it. Next slide. So this is a photo as part of an archive of submissions for considerations for protection as part of safeguarding practices of sacred spaces and important cultural places. In this case, the cultural heritage of the Totonac people of Veracruz, Mexico. And you see them there arrayed in front of a Mayan pyramid that you might recognize. And this is now a safeguarded space. What I want to draw a little bit of attention to is that most of the time, for example, for the case of cultural heritage safeguards and protections, considerations of non-economic and intangible loss, to stick with the UN's way of talking about it, treats the intangible, whatever we mean by that, as directly contingent upon the tangible. What do I mean? So far, much more attention has been given to understanding the impacts of climate change upon the physical integrity of heritage sites, focusing largely on climate threats that potentially hasten the decay, say, physical decay of such a site. Intangible heritage, in turn, is always considered in site-specific terms and in ways that I want to argue constrains the meaning of that heritage to that site. What this can do is effectively elevate specific authorized meanings or accounts of heritage, say as promoted by nation states as part of the multilateral process for heritage safeguarding, while typically marginalizing or erasing competing meanings, often contentious histories, or the political and social context of the production of that heritage itself. I'm going to call this a repository's approach to cultural meaning. But I also want to argue that cultural meaning is not just found in the material. Now, saying that, it's important to underscore that we need to recognize that sacred landscapes, sacred spaces, indigenous territory. All of these things are real and important. So I'm not in any way suggesting we should ignore the relevance of those things. I'm instead exploring why it's the case that the way we attribute meaning always relies in a way that I think is one-sided on the material context in a very basic way, on the sort of site-specific importance of a site. Next slide. Now, this is might seem a little bit of a break from what we've been talking about. What are we looking at? This is a diagram of Ferdinand de Saussure's theory of the sign. So bear with me for a second. De Saussure was an early 20th century French semiotician, as many of you probably know, and he famously insisted upon what he called the arbitrary nature of the sign. What did he mean? Well, he did not assume that, for example, words faithfully represent the world, right? Where a given word, we should understand a given word as referring to a single object in the world in a particular way to identify it: chair, table, bumblebee. Instead, his insight was that words were incorporated into signs, and signs were typically composed of two parts, a signifier and a signified. The signifier, or what he called, to the confusion of many, the sound image. This is what we typically call a word or name something. Calls up a related concept, which he called the concept of, for example, a bumblebee, in contrast to an actual buzzing, flying bumblebee. And together, the sound image and the concept, these form what he calls, what Saussure called, a sign, which for him was a way of talking about a fundamental unit of meaning. Signs for Saussure, and this is why I'm belaboring this point, are not dependent in any way intrinsically upon a connection to the empirical world. And indeed, most of what we know about how meaning is generated, is produced, is made, makes it clear that there's no necessary prior empirical state of affairs. But this is what international cultural policy is insisting upon in the context of the response to climate change. Next slide. So heritage policy, I'm arguing, has limitations as it's currently being developed that make it hard to address the implications of cultural loss, such as collective, cosmological, religious, or community concerns, not intrinsically or necessarily connected to specific places or material assets. A short list of what I'm talking about and what might be flying under the radar of the intangible might include beliefs, discourses, stories, values, myths, rituals, as these inform and help to animate lived histories, collective memory, ancestral relationships, rights, and justice claims. It seems to me that cultural policy has yet to recognize what we might think about as the room or available play between the empirical world, sites, places, landscapes, ecosystems, and intangible cultural expression. Room that theoretically grants artists more and varied imaginative opportunities. And I just want to end here quickly with just a very superficial exploration of what that might look like. Indigenous artists in particular, I am no expert in Indigenous art, but seem to be already and in all kinds of different creative ways plumbing the depths of what I mean when I'm talking about the intangible. So here we're looking at an example of a visual representation of myth. So this is Storm Anjakoneb, a very well-known self-taught Indigenous artist from the Lac-Seul First Nation in Canada. She calls this the creation story. It's a print and it's a depiction of the Ojibwa legend of how Turtle Island came to be. Now, I don't understand exactly, or rather put another way, I can't entirely decode what that looks like, but nevertheless, it's an interesting image of the intangible. Next slide. This one is about storytelling. It's anonymous. There's no date. It's a textile. It's representation of an Aboriginal song line. A song line or dreaming track is one of the paths across the land or sky that marks the route followed by localized creator beings in the dreaming as understood by Aboriginal peoples in Australia. And then finally, and just to conclude, this last slide here. This is by Lawrence Paul Yuxwalupton from the Musqueam Squamish First Nation, in which it's today British Columbia. It's called Unceded Territories. This was made with virtual reality software, and it explores the intersections of environmental engagement, understanding from the Squamish perspective with claims for Indigenous rights. It's an interesting image, and I'd like to know what Lawrence is thinking about it, but these are just different ways in which we might think of possible artistic interventions around the intangible. It is something that people are clearly doing, and I guess with that I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Rob. Exactly, virtual claps. Thank you very much. Without further ado, I will give the floor to Andrea for her presentation. And for the attendees, if you want to start thinking about questions to Rob, then please put them in the Q&A box.
Chokwe utesia leosim chaniawo mawayaim means respectful greetings to you, my relatives, in the Yaqui indigenous language. My tribal nation, where I'm sitting now, is the Sonora Desert, which extends from southern Arizona, United States, to Sonora, Mexico, where we have our 8 traditional governments of the Yaqui Nation in a place called Rio Yaqui, named after the Yaqui River in Sonora. So we, as I mentioned before, have experienced an international border, a very seriously maintained border between the United States and Mexico, run down the middle of our homeland. But we are indigenous farmers in Mexico. Our land comes up to the Gulf of California, as it's called. That small skinny body of water between what's called Baja California and the mainland of Mexico. And so we are also fishers there, not here in Arizona. We're nowhere near an ocean waterway. But thank you, and I will be speaking from an Indigenous peoples perspective. I have extensive experience at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Processes for several decades, and also was part of the formation of what's called the Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform, which was put in place with the Paris Agreement, and focuses on the importance of Indigenous peoples' knowledge and practices to solutions on climate change. And we've been able to bring into that process through the work of the LSIP and the Facilitative Working Group, which is made up of 7 state party representatives and 7 Indigenous peoples representatives that were selected by their own regions, the 7 biocultural regions of Indigenous peoples. And I have the opportunity to be the first member starting in 2019, when the Facilitative Working Group, or FWG, was founded, representing North America. And I was the second co-chair of this body at the UNFCCC, which is now recognizing the importance of Indigenous peoples' knowledge to building solutions on climate change. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and you can start the slideshow if you want. Thank you so much. This is an example of Indigenous peoples' ways of knowing, directly related to some of the things that Rob was addressing as well. This is a traditional corn altar from the Zapoteca Indigenous peoples in southern Mexico. And you can see a fairly universal cultural representation here of the four colors, the four sacred colors of the corn, the red, the black, the yellow, and the white, which represents spiritually to Indigenous peoples, even with North America Indigenous peoples and the Sundance of the Lakotas and many others. These four colors are consistent, representing the four directions, the four sacred winds. Some people even say it represents the four sacred colors of the human family. But it also illustrates, I think, some of the things Rob was talking about the lack of reality of distinguishing between, you can say, economic and non-economic, regarding cultural heritage, tangible and intangible, because the four sacred colors of the corn are essential for Indigenous peoples like mine, which are farmers, desert farmers, to represent the biodiversity of Indigenous peoples' food systems that is essential for our survival in climate change. For example, our elders and traditional farmers and that are alive today and practicing know the weather from looking at the moon and the insects and others, not just next week, but 6 months from now, when the corn is going to be growing next year. They can tell if it's going to be a wet year or a dry year, a cold year, a hot year. So what color and variety of corn to plant. And this is not divided into tangible and intangible cultural heritage. In fact, we have lots of examples why we kind of ponder that that's even a discussed reality. I understand it. We work on international repatriation, including repatriation of traditional seeds, but cultural items and human remains that are in museums all over the world. Universities, scientific institutions, auction houses, and looking at the relationship of what they call tangible and intangible cultural heritage for Indigenous peoples. For instance, we worked 20 years to have our sacred Masokova, our traditional deer head, returned from the National Museum in Stockholm, Sweden, to the Yaqui homeland. It happened last year in July after 20 years of struggle. And we realized, working with UNESCO, United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, that they consider the actual physical deer head, which for us is a living being. Once it's been in the ceremony, it's not an artifact, it's alive, as tangible cultural heritage. But the knowledge, the dances, the songs, the healing power, the cultural understanding of origins and creation stories, all those are considered intangible, where for us, we don't separate those. So I just wanted to bring this out. And this also represents solutions. And it also represents rights, because a lot of times I think rights are not considered. Rob referred to them in his talk, but the rights of Indigenous peoples are considered non-economic, and these aren't real separations for me. We look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the minimum standard for our work in the international arena. It says it's the minimum standard for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples of the world. That struggle took 30 years, from 1977 to 2007, when it was finally adopted by the UN General Assembly. And it's the only UN standard that is based on collective rights of Indigenous peoples. Our rights cannot be reduced, even though they include and uplift individual rights within the context of our membership and identity of our peoples, which is intrinsically tied to our land base. Next slide, please. I just want to point out Article 31. I'll move myself over a little bit so I can read which way do I go? Which is the right to cultural heritage in the UN Declaration. Even though many of the articles of the Declaration refer to rights essential for the practice of our culture and spirituality, but it says that we have the right to maintain, control, protect, and develop our cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, and traditional cultural expressions, as well as the manifestation of our sciences. Very important. The General Assembly, through this adoption of the Declaration, has recognized that we have science as Indigenous peoples. A lot of times, science is seen as a Western factor or expression, and they talk about our traditional knowledge, but it's never considered on the same level. Whereas, you know, we knew the practices I referred to before ensured our survival for millennia. We didn't have stores or, you know, Walmart to go to and buy food if our crops failed. But it also talks about our knowledge of flora and fauna, our seeds, you know, all of these are essential aspects of our ability to survive climate change, but also are also under threat today. Next slide. Of course, people know this, the UN estimates that 1 million species today face extinction. One example is in the slide is the California salmon, because of rising temperatures, because of course, industrial impacts on the bay, the San Francisco Bay, where the salmon swim through, and pollution, but climate change as well, salinization and other aspects that are a result. And they're not even expected to survive past the end of this century. And this is not only a basis of nutrition and food for Indigenous peoples, but these are very, very important, as are many, many species that we live with all over the world, including corn, part of our creation stories, our clans, our cultural identities, our ceremonies, and it's a reciprocal relationship. The salmon peoples along the west coast of North America use salmon in their ceremonies, but they also understand that the songs they sing and their ceremonies and prayers help the salmon to return to where they need to return. Next slide, please. Again, this is an example. This picture is actually from our land, our family farm here where I'm sitting in Arizona. And our food systems, and I also sat as a member for a time when it was just forming of under the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage at the UNFCCC. They began a new body called the Expert Group on Non-Economic Losses, NABS. I brought up the fact that our food sovereignty, our food systems are both economic and non-economic. Our food systems are very comprehensive, and they include entities and aspects that we don't eat. And one example is the Sonora desert toad that comes out of the ground. They hibernate. They live for more than 20 years. They're huge. And they come out of the ground with the heavy rains that used to be very predictable at the end of July and August. And they immediately begin to eat all the insects, which impact the harvest time of our crops. And in recent years, they've been threatened with extinction here. We've seen a dramatic decrease in their population because the rains don't come predictably anymore. And about 4 years ago, we got the heavy rains in June, which totally out of season. It knocked down a lot of the plants that were just starting to bud in the desert, but also the toads came out of the ground, they thought it was the time to come out, and then it got hot and dry again because it was still just dune, and this is the desert, it's hot. And so many of them died, they dried up and died. And so since that time, there's been a dramatic decrease, and this directly affects our food systems, even though we don't eat the toads. Next slide, please. This is another example, of course, of cultural loss. This is a cemetery, burial ground, indigenous peoples in Malaysia, because of rising sea levels and also as a result of a hurricane that happened there. And this is just one example of cultural loss. But in the Pacific, just like the Kuna Islands, we have many members. With the Kuna General Congress is a member of the International Indian Treaty Council. And the impact on Pacific Islands peoples and Caribbean island peoples is not only this kind of, I guess you could say, tangible cultural devastation, but many of them, like the Kunas, Tuvalu and others, have to move. And that is not only the losses and the threats to cultural practices and ways of living that Rob talked about. For many of them, they don't have a place to go to like the Kunas do, which is still their recognized territory. They're going to have to become immigrants in New Zealand or Australia, and they have lost their political identity, their self-determination as a people, as a nation. And that is the most, in many ways, irreparable loss for Indigenous peoples. Next slide. We are, of course, faced with the fact that the states do not want to cut back on fossil fuel production. The U.S. is pushing for so-called transition mineral mining, lithium, etc. But last year was the largest level of domestic oil production in the history of the United States. So they're not doing it instead of and cutting back on fossil fuels. They're doing it in addition to, and much of that's being carried out on Indigenous peoples' lands. And we're addressing the fact that, you know, we're attending these international meetings as Indigenous peoples more and more, including our knowledge holders, but the thirst and lust for fossil fuels is not abating. In fact, in many places like Africa, they're looking at it as part of their transition, just transition, as transition away from poverty, as greater amounts of oil production. Next slide. So the 1.5 temperature goal is quickly slipping away. In fact, last year in July and August, globally and here in the Sonora Desert, also that supposed cap of 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, they blew through that, and it doesn't look like it's going back. This is a picture of knowledge holders that we brought for the first time at the COP in Glasgow, COP 26, 2 years ago, and they made a statement collectively. These are our 35 knowledge holders from around the world, from all 7 regions. And they're recognizing that the loss and damage we have suffered from impacts of climate change is already extreme and is both economic and non-economic, and directly affects knowledge systems and ways of life. So this is something Indigenous peoples are affirming. Next slide. I just wanted to highlight this because, you know, some of the solutions that they're pushing for, I think they think we don't know what net means when they say net zero. Nature-based solutions, who knows what that means? Or we say what solutions are not nature-based. But now it's green economy that they're talking about. And these are 2 examples of lithium mining directly impacting Indigenous peoples. The one on the left is affecting our lands in Sonora, Mexico. And now they're pushing for something called the Plan de Sonora, with a $48 billion proposed investment from the United States, basically to create the largest lithium production area on the planet in the Sonora Desert, using groundwater, which there's very little of, which will also permanently contaminate the Yaqui River, which is our source of life. little further to the west of where this is going to be taking place. And they announced it. Mexican and U.S. government did a press conference in Dubai at the COP. Another one is a sacred site, a sacred place in Nevada, Thatcher Pass it's called, and the tribes there vehemently oppose lithium mining in that area because it will destroy, important cultural resource for them. But the U.S. government, like governments around the world, are waiving those kinds of environmental and cultural impact assessments because it's considered green economy. For us, transition mining, transition minerals, or just transition, if it's carried out in the same way they've done coal, oil, gas, uranium on our homelands, destroying our sacred sites and ways of life, our food systems, our health, intergenerational health, then it's not a transition. It's more of the same, just because it's lithium for car batteries or minerals for solar panels, wind power, the same. We helped the Pitt River tribe in California defeat a massive industrial wind farm on a sacred mountain, and the Samis did the same because it would destroy a reindeer grazing area. So we have to come up with a solution, that is really green, that respects rights of indigenous peoples, as well as our cultural practices, our food systems, for it to really be called a solution from our point of view. Next slide. Just getting towards the end. I know my time is probably close, but we do have solutions to offer. On the left, this is our land here in our desert farm. We're using drought-resistant seeds, and down below, we're trading those seeds. This is a picture from our corn conference of trading drought-resistant seeds between the Dene or Navajo peoples and Yaquis. Bringing back our traditional use of seeds that can resist long periods of heat and drought and use very little water. On the right, on the top, that's Oahu, Hawaii, where the indigenous peoples were able to regain their land, about 2,000 acres, which was, of course, taken from them in the process of colonization. And the first thing they did is removed about 2,000 eucalyptus trees, which were invasive implants from Australia that use a lot of water. And immediately, when they did that, they used it for planters and homes, and chopped up the wood. But with those eucalyptus trees gone, the water table came right back up, and they're planting taro, which, like rice, grows in water, which is their traditional food source. And on the bottom, we have over 80 tribes in North America that are restoring the buffalo, which are the indigenous mammals here, as opposed to the cattle. Buffalo clip the top of the plants when they eat them, and cows and cattle pull them up by the roots, which depletes the soil as well, because soil, healthy living soil, is the third largest absorber of greenhouse gases after the oceans and the air. So buffalo also withstand large swings of temperatures. In 2015 in South Dakota, there was an out-of-season blizzard, which is happening more and more because of climate change, and 100,000 cattle died. The farmers didn't know in advance, so they couldn't bring them into the barns, but no buffalo died, not one single one. They know how to withstand the variances of climate, like all original indigenous plants, animals, and fish do, as opposed to invasive species that have been brought in. Next slide. This is an example of seed trading. This long route is from Hopi white corn. The Hopi live in northern Arizona, and they know how to grow, and the seeds they use know how to grow with hardly any water. They have no streams, rivers, or springs. It's all groundwater from rain and snow. And this is the production of that corn here, just to the south and the Sonora Desert. You can see the nopal cactus in back, and it grows just beautifully. So we're restoring those trade routes among our peoples that we had pre-colonial to enhance our vitality and viability in the time of climate crisis. Next slide. Very important, the elders' knowledge sharing. This is here in the Sonora Desert, talking about protecting the plants from the eclipse. The other slide is gathering wild roots in Alaska. And all of these timings are changing because of climate change, but because our elders know how to predict that weather and those changes, it's very important they're working with the young people to make sure that that knowledge is passed on among our peoples. Next slide. Protecting sacred areas and shell mounds, cultural practices. This is just a quick example of the Tule marshes in the coast of California, and I know all indigenous peoples have similar types of cultural relations with the plants in their area. They're gathering, the little girls are gathering the Tule. You can see they make baskets and boats out of it, but a Tule marsh, one scientist says, absorbs 10 times more carbon than a pine forest. But also this is where our sacred sites are for the people there, shell mounds and other areas. So the relationship between culture and solutions to climate change, prevention of climate change, as well as adaptation, is very concrete for us, not intangible. Next slide. I know that I'm at the end of my time, but I just want to say one advance that we were able to make at COP27 was including Indigenous peoples on the advisory board of a new body called the Santiago Network Advisory Board, which provides technical assistance to states. And we also got Indigenous peoples included and food producers as being able to offer and also accept technical assistance, and Indigenous peoples have a seat on that board. I'm the alternate for the Indigenous peoples constituency, and we've had just one meeting. Next. This is a picture of the first meeting that happened in March of the new Santiago Network Advisory Board. Gideon Sanango on the right in that picture is the main representative, and I'm the alternate, but we work, as a team, and he's Masai from Tanzania, pastoralist. Next slide. So our core recommendations are focusing on prevention, and not necessarily finances for assistance after the fact, full participation and respect for our rights, our knowledge, and our expertise, as well as our cultural practices. And this is from here in the Sonora Desert, Tono Otom, our neighbor tribe. They're singing to the plants, and the elder is teaching the young girl the songs that those sawalka, the squash, we grow that too, or you could say pumpkins from here, original pumpkins, what they thrive on, and that relationship with Indigenous peoples and the natural world is what sustains us, and we feel is what's going to sustain the world if they want to listen to us in the coming time of climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Andrea, Rob. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts, your experiences, and your research. I think both of the talks were incredibly thoughtful, but also incredibly nuanced in terms of mapping out the myriad of intersections of intangibility and the kind of policy and climate regime that we have, but also going beyond that, of course. And I think it would be good to actually start with the policy regime and the intersections, because you both spoke so much about this, and obviously I'm doing work which meaningfully tries to contribute and challenge that. So the first question I would like to open with is, what does the climate change regime look like that truly centers pluralistic Indigenous ways of knowing about these issues? How would this change how we are approaching, averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage? And how also this would change the very framing on loss and damage, which both of you seem to be saying that it's inadequate, and obviously that the dichotomy presented of non-economic and economic is false.
Do you want to go first? I have a short answer for that as an example. Okay. I'm going to be talking mainly about, the international arena and the policy framework there. And I can give a positive example that just happened at the last COP28 in Dubai, United Arab Emirates. We had seen, because I've been both, active member of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, which we call the Indigenous Caucus, is the easiest way to say it, which is of a large group, more than 200 Indigenous peoples, literally from around the world, from all the regions, participate on a regular basis in that. But kind of a siloing effect of the creation of this local communities, Indigenous peoples platform, and those activities bringing the knowledge holders in, and the actual negotiations by the states, which is, what the result is. They come and they listen to Indigenous peoples, and or John Kerry from the United States or others want to meet with us. The president of the COP always wants to meet with us, but then they go their merry way into the negotiations and don't even mention Indigenous peoples. But we saw a change for the first time in that. Where I follow very closely article 6 of the Paris Rule Book, which we had we had a lot of issues with, especially the emphasis on market-based solutions, carbon trading, more false solutions, we think. But
I'm just going to drop in, for those who don't know, Article 6, from what I seem to remember, relates to the climate finance, isn't it? And the carbon credits and things like that.
It's called international cooperation, which is, they have market and non-market. And the market-based approaches, we're fighting hard for a grievance mechanism. So Indigenous peoples whose rights are being impacted by things like green economy, carbon trading, carbon offsets, resulting in relocation of Indigenous peoples, have a way to come in and oppose that. But Article 6.8 focuses on what's called non-market solutions. And really the states and the contact groups have a hard time even focusing. There are a bunch of countries there, but they don't know, what does that mean? Bringing in African oil palms, pushing out the Indigenous peoples who are farming. But we presented the things that I just presented here in terms of Indigenous knowledge of soil protection and soil restoration, drought-resistant farming, because also industrial farming uses inordinate amount of water. And they got very excited about it. And I heard them talk about it in other policy discussions, that Indigenous peoples have another definition of non-market solutions that they were very excited about thinking, and they gave them a whole new definition of what they were talking about. And it's the first time that I've seen kind of that cross-pollination of Indigenous knowledge systems brought into the actual negotiations on positions that they're taking. So, and especially because that's a understanding about transition from industrial agriculture to sustainable methods using Indigenous knowledge, that we choose to share free, prior, informed consent, right, is a basis of any knowledge sharing. But it's a positive contribution we can make. A lot of times we're on the defense for good reason with all these matters, including the solutions, so to speak. But this is a positive contribution that is suddenly being recognized by the states that we can add to. So that's an example of how we might impact the policy regime. But right now they're talking about, instead of reducing fossil fuel production, they changed, both the chair, the presidency, US and others are now talking about emissions reduction. And it kind of sounds good at first, but what that means to them is technology for carbon capture. not cutting back on fossil fuels, but, technology that doesn't even work, or we don't know if it works, and it seems harmful to us to re-inject, byproducts of industrial development back into the earth. So that's my answer.
That's a great example. I would say, just add this. So one of the things with just thinking about the loss and damage framework as we've inherited it as part of the way that multilateral institutions through the UN system and the UNFCCC and the IPCC and stuff, how we've come to deal with this question. In a way, it's a case of the tail wagging the dog. And what I mean by that is, as Andrea was alluding to, much of how we determine sort of what is legibly lost or damaged depends upon our ability to transmute those losses into countable economic terms. And we still are very much stuck in a way of thinking about loss and damage that really only cares about economically valued losses. And, of course, most of us and all of us are aware that, we now have this loss and damage fund. We're now, as it was authorized to and stood up in the last COP 28. And now we're going about the work of figuring out how the fund is going to work, and, how those funds are going to be distributed, and who's going to be managing the fund. The World Bank. And so since the World Bank is now, taking up control of the fund, one suspects that we're going to see more of same in terms of a difficulty of communicating about the kinds of losses that aren't legible in the terms that this framework is currently insisting upon, or the dominant framework that we're using to understand loss and damage. How can we pluralize that? Well, it's going to be difficult structurally until and when our system, our international system, as we participate in it, can move past the fact of nation states as the primary and exclusive actors in this arena, and the requirement upon legibly economically valued losses that steer things toward, kind of material countable things. One quick example. So I've spent a lot of time living and working in the Andean region, mostly in Bolivia. And the Andes is a particularly rich regional space for the indigenous production of all kinds of other conceptions of the relationship between human beings and the natural world. And a lot of these have gone, sort of farther beyond just the Andes itself to kind of influence or participate in broader dialogues about how to pluralize that relationship. And the one I would just point quickly to is the Buen Vivir paradigm, the living well paradigm from Bolivia and Ecuador in particular, as that's been incorporated into constitutions and laws, and as it has actually had uptake, in the UN context. But while that's been influential, at least as a discourse, it certainly hasn't as a practice. And what we've seen in the UN context is an uptake that takes it and transforms it into kind of UN amenable terms in a way that kind of pays lip service to the idea of indigenous participation in conversations about that. I think we should be right to question. If we can bring a better rights and justice framework, a more nuanced rights and justice framework into these discussions in a meaningful way, that I think is probably the most hopeful path forward.
I'm just going to add one short comment. I know there's other questions, but Indigenous peoples are a little bit disturbed and concerned by the emphasis and all the attention on this loss and damage fund. I think they're officially calling it the Climate Impact Fund, because what they want to call non-economic losses, which for us, means culture, means rights, identity, our spiritual relationship with our traditional lands, all of those aspects, our food systems, which, like I said, are both economic and non-economic for Indigenous peoples. That seems to have kind of fallen off the table at the last conference of the parties, that discussion. And for one thing, there's nowhere near enough money to compensate the economic losses, number one, that are on the table. It's just going to be for what they say now, countries that are developed. I don't know about that. Maybe industrialized would be a better word than develop or non-developed, undeveloping. And off the table is developed countries, including Indigenous peoples in the Arctic, in the Pacific Islands, in North America, in desert areas like us, because we happen now to fall into the United States. We didn't create those countries. They were created on top of us and through a great deal of genocide. So I think, those are some of the challenges that we're looking at. And there's nothing in there for direct funding to Indigenous peoples, even in so-called developing countries. It's all through the states, which is, very problematic. So, those are some questions. Everyone celebrated. It was the big news on the first day of the COP, but we have a lot of questions about it as Indigenous peoples and a lot of doubts. And the main one, I'll just end with what the knowledge holders said, is that the losses that we're suffering are not compensatable with money. How are you going to pay for more Sonora Desert toads, or for, the rains to come at the right time, so that they can thrive and therefore eat the bugs that eat our crops. So, it's a lot of the main losses that we're looking at are not able to be put into monetary terms, even if we could access those funds, which we can't.
Thank you so much for elaborating. You've actually ticked a lot of questions that I had by kind of transitioning organically to different aspects. The attendees, thank you so much for putting the questions forward. Keep them coming. I will transition to the attendees' questions in 4 minutes, but I'm just going to try to put forward another question from our list of questions, particularly in relation to creative practitioners, but also, widely kind of understood researchers. How do you think artistic practices, giving their kind of aesthetic resurfacing of aspects, but very often also political kind of nature, how they can kind of contribute to transformative thinking in particular around this issue in the policy space? I'm thinking particularly around things like how artists often connect harm and reparation and care and see them sort of in a very holistic way. That's a very broad question. What do you think is a kind of generative way of engaging both in this space and in these topics?
Go ahead, Andrea.
No, you go.
Okay.
Then I'll go.
Great. So two not particularly original thoughts. The first is that I think we often, and I'm using, very liberally the royal, the collective we, non-specific we, tend to imagine artists as playing a very specific role, and it's very constraining. And that role tends to be the sort of diplomatic communicational role I was referring to earlier, where artists are message amplifiers of key issues that we're supposed to understand we need to be paying more attention to. And given the role of helping us to imagine what, near possible futures might or might not look like, and to, help us to get our minds around, large structural questions like climate change and so on, to visualize them concretely, say. And I don't have any problem with that role, but I do think it's predictable and in some ways redundant, and that, not all artists should be doing that, perhaps. So I would make a distinction between the sort of communication diplomatic role where when upon viewing, say, a piece of visual art, one receives a kind of clear directive or message, like this is what this is trying to tell me. And contrast that with art that invites more introspection and presents maybe ambiguous problems to solve, where the messaging isn't altogether clear, and where we're going to have to grapple with what it is we're seeing or experiencing in a different way. And that's a more sort of problem-raising mode as opposed to, communicational role. So I know that's vague, but it's sort of all in the emphasis and orientation of the practice. The other thing I would point out is that artists, of course, are just one category of cultural producer. And cultural producers are finding themselves inserted into, the global creative economy in all kinds of ways that predetermine like possibilities for action. And so there is a whole parallel necessary engagement around what is the agency of cultural producers, and what does that mean? And I don't just mean copyright, or AI, but sure, those things are part of it. Where at this point, we're seeing a systematic divestment of that agency from, I think, from artists of all shapes and sizes in different, sometimes alarming ways, which will make it harder for example, artists to participate organically in things like climate movements.
I think from what I've seen, I've used this image before that humans are like that, frog in the water. That story where you put the frog in the cold water and he's happy swimming in the pot, but heating it up, and he doesn't realize till it's too late, till he's cooked, that thing that he should have jumped out, when it was just getting warm. And humans, even indigenous peoples, they can't fathom, I think, what's coming and what's been done, and happening here. People say, boy, it was hot last summer. Wow, it's raining, and it doesn't ever rain in June, but it's the desert, so we're happy that it's raining. They didn't realize, what's actually going on. And I've being in some of these official bodies, had the opportunity to listen to the climate scientists. And I don't even like to tell, when I speak on these things, some of the things that they're saying, how bad really, it's going to be and already is getting. So, but humans don't envision they could be among the million species that could become extinct. That's just not something we can fathom. We think we're, invulnerable to all this stuff. So, bees dying off like they are, just that one thing alone, or coral reefs, is going to create, and is creating, a chain reaction that humans are not set up to be able to, see themselves as part of that, chain. But artists, I think, can play a really important role in communicating, like Rob said, in transmitting on a gut level, on an emotional level, which I think is what has to happen. Because for the mass of people, their intellect can't comprehend what's really happening, but their emotion could. And the threat to their children, and I mean, this is real stuff. This is life and death. It's not just some kind of other issue, that we're working on. And I think the artistic community could popularize, the information and the reality to the greater society in a way that I haven't seen yet.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I believe that the question that I've asked answers Martha's question, which was, how do you see the role of art in the critical panorama? I'm kind of thinking critical landscape regarding loss and damage, and the topic addressed right now in the talk. I think that has been addressed. Martha, please put in the chat if that hasn't, and I will kind of repost the question. But I wanted to move on to the next question, which is very specific, and perhaps, Andrea, you're best to answer that, but Rob, please also feel free to input if you can speak to that. The question is, how are gendered aspects of loss and damage addressed?
First
Do
of
you
all,
have
yeah, I can, gender, we usually mean men and women. We were talking about that gender issues for Indigenous peoples at a board meeting of the International Indian Treaty Council. All of our board members are representing affiliates and are Indigenous. And our Zapoteca board member from Southern Mexico says, well, I'm not sure how to understand the question. He said in Spanish, but he said, our peoples have 4 genders. So, just to put that out there, that's not the case for all Indigenous peoples. But when we talk about gender, I think we're usually talking about men and women here. But there is a gender constituency at the UNFCCC. And Indigenous peoples work closely with them, just like we do with the Youth and Children constituency. There were 9 major groups that were established at the first Earth Summit in 1992, including Indigenous peoples as standalone, and local communities. We're trying to deal with that problem of conflation or vulnerable groups, or where they try to lump us, right? Indigenous peoples as peoples under international law were recognized even back then, before we had the UN Declaration. So we do work closely, probably with those 2 others, and those also are constituencies that were recognized with a seat on this new Santiago Network Advisory Board for averting, adapting, and mitigating climate change, technical assistance providing. So we're going to continue working with them closely and structurally. And of course, Indigenous peoples greatly value, women's traditional knowledge and scientific knowledge. In fact, the UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples did a specific study on that. One of his 2 studies last year was Indigenous scientific knowledge of Indigenous women related to exactly these issues: environment, climate change, food production. Women are the seed keepers. That's when we talk about repatriation of sacred items and human remains. The people that are working on seeds say, well, you got to say rematriation if you're talking about seeds. So, there's a recognition for us of the balance, the Malamecha, is grandmother moon that controls the water, around the planet, including the water in our bodies. We can never forget, we are part of this natural world. We're not talking about something separate from ourselves. I addressed the UN water conference last year and reminded everyone, the heads of state, everyone was there, that we are water, talking about water, to water. We're mainly water. We're 70% water, just like the planet is, the Earth is. So, we're not separate from these things. And Indigenous peoples naturally recognize we're all of us, men and women, are 70% feminine because we're 70% water, and water is a female.
Water with water. I love that's a great formulation. Before saying something briefly about gender questions, circling back to the earlier question, it occurs to me also that one of the issues to think about is scale, and that artists have an opportunity in terms of how to present scale as a problem to get one's head around in the context of kind of climate problem solving, particularly in sort of abilities to convey intimacy of relationships, social relationships of humans and animals and nature, but also larger scale. So I think scale is a fertile ground, if you will, for thinking more about what art can be doing in that space. On the question of gender, not to belabor it, but the Glynna example comes to mind immediately. One of the things that we see is that this is a largely matriarchal society, but that one of the things that's happened through the negotiation with the Panamanian government and with international development agencies is this assumption that we should be talking to the leaders, tribal leaders, who it's understood to somehow be men. And that's partly because the people, the interlocutors who are trying to have this conversation with Guna don't understand the way that Guna have construct their social worlds. And so often are putting people in positions of decision-making in ways that kind of run in the wrong direction, I guess, with respect to how Guna themselves go about doing those things. And you haven't had that kind of due diligence. Similar things happen in the Andes all the time. There's a term in Quechua, chachawarmi, which refers to awkwardly translated gender complementarity, but that extends to from humans to the ecosystem in all kinds of challenging ways. And it's a way of thinking about environment that people, when they're concerned about environmental loss or sustainability, rarely take on board.
Amazing. Thank you both for your answers. I'm going to make another switch. We've got a technical question coming, but that's the joy of this forum, which is very interdisciplinary. We've got a question about from Wellington, from Zimbabwe. In the revised NDCs, which for those, the acronym stands for National Determined Contributions, countries are increasingly including sections of loss and damage. This may involve assessing their country's vulnerability, outlining plans for addressing loss and damage, or calling for greater international support and finance. Examples of loss and damage provisions in NDCs include Mexico's plan for a national loss and damage fund, Jamaica's focus on disaster risk management, and Bangladesh's emphasis on early warning systems. My question is, to what extent loss and damage should be addressed through nationally determined contributions versus other international mechanisms?
Andrea?
The NDCs. We did a study when I was a member of the facilitative working group for the LSIP. One of our activities was to assess the round of NDCs that had just been turned in to see how number one, how many of the states actually integrated indigenous peoples that had indigenous peoples in their states or their colonies into the process of developing the NDCs. And we could not find, we had a team assessing along with the secretariat that helped us assessing it, and we couldn't find any. There were more than 90 NDCs that had been turned in that first round, and I think they said 17 mentioned indigenous peoples, but only 2. I think no, I'm remembering now. Only 2, New Zealand and Canada, talked about actually consulting with indigenous peoples at all, and 17 vaguely mentioned indigenous peoples. Mainly to say, that they recognize the losses and damages that were affecting indigenous peoples in their territories, whether it was fires or drought or, hurricanes and other things. So we supposedly when the resolution that at Katowice that created the facilitative working group and operationalized, as they say, the LSIP, the Local Communities Indigenous Peoples Platform. One of the calls in the resolution was this will provide a better opportunity for states to include indigenous peoples' inputs into the LDCs. I don't know if the current cohort members of the FWG, I'm going to be there at the next meeting, which starts, middle of next week in Bonn. But talk about, has that improved with the last round? I don't know, but I'm going to ask them. But it wasn't very good the first round. So just to say that.
Yeah, that makes sense as well. I would just add one thing, which is that the national contributions as a mechanism, it's been effective for some states more than for others in terms of how well the needs or concerns of diverse constituencies within those states are represented. And I would just add that one of the things we see is that SIDS nations in particular, small island developing states, because of the fact that there's a kind of significant overlap between the category of the nation state and the community in question, and there's not such a clear hierarchical situation of being underneath maybe a cumbersome state apparatus where you're one among many different communities. That mechanism has worked well, I think, for SIDS countries because there's more uniformity and more ability to assert needs and interests more directly. Otherwise, yeah, it's been challenging, and I would just say that the consultation problem is kind of like the other side of the coin from free prior informed consent. It's the same dilemma of the language of consultation is regularly used, but substantive consultation and then acting in good faith on the outcomes of those consultations is rarely in evidence.
Yes, I agree with you on SIDS, and I was really excited to co-chair because the way the facilitative working group of the LSIP is organized, the co-chairs, there's one selected by the Indigenous Peoples members and one selected by the state members. So when I was the co-chair of the state co-chair was Yo Mulalap from Malaysia, Micronesia. He's from Micronesia, and he's an Indigenous person. And that's one, reason, especially in the Pacific, the SIDS many times are basically Indigenous states.
Right.
There is kind of a different approach there. We have one of our representatives who's leaving today. He's kind of based in Geneva for us, following the Human Rights Council and all that. But he himself is from Maluku in the Pacific, which is colonized right now by Indonesia, and kind of brutally. But anyway, he's invited officially to participate in the SIDS meeting on climate change that will be starting. I think it's going to be in the Caribbean. In the next couple of days. So I agree with you. It's a different situation there. For instance, the Tuvalu Indigenous peoples that I mentioned, that they have no more fresh water because of the rising of the sea level, and they're going to have to leave. They have to bring in water now. And, they used to plant and, of course, everything you use water for, drink there. And it has to all be brought in because all their water is now salt water that exists on their island. And so obviously they're going to have to move, but they're a country, with their own government, even though they're Indigenous peoples. All Indigenous peoples have our own governments. The Alaska Indigenous governments that live, the villages along the coast of Alaska are going to have to move too. Their homes are falling into the ocean, but there's not money, even in the United States, they say, to actually move them intact to a whole other place. The Kunas have the advantage because they own the land and the islands, and up to the top of the cloud forest there in Panama, they own 1/6 of the country. And they'll tell you about the revolution of Nele Cantule, 100 years next year. They're planning big things, for that. But how they won that territory. But I just wanted to mention that for them, their cultural teachings, their original instructions, you could say, was that they should live on the islands and they go to the mainland for farming and hunting and, but then they come back to sleep. Now, that's part of the reason why this is taking so long, and they're still really pondering it, because they're breaking their original cultural teachings. by contemplating moving to the mainland. They don't want to do that, just intrinsically, but they have to because their islands are going underwater. They don't have fresh water, just like Tuvalu. So just to bring these things, to highlight the kind of loss of your whole government and your whole identity. What will you be then? Immigrants, refugees in New Zealand, or Guatemala or wherever you can move. The Kunas at least have a mainland to move to. The Pacific Island people do not.
Yes, and I think we have to wrap up now, but like you say, the question of rights and what you said, Rob, around sort of justice and rights really comes strongly because then it transitions into bigger questions of land rights and all that, as you said. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I wanted to say massive thank you to the speakers for your invaluable contributions to today's workshop and to our attendees for your active participation. I'm really sorry I couldn't get through all of your questions. Thank you to the residents for their engagement and to the Open Society Foundation and the Loss and Damage Collaboration for their generous support in making this workshop possible. To stay informed about the future events and updates, we encourage you to sign up for the Ways of Repair mailing list. We will also like to share with you a short feedback questionnaire. We would be very grateful for any suggestions that would help us to improve future events. And just to say that the recording, reading list, and slides will be shared via email and on our Ways of Repair website in the coming days. Again, thank you very much for your participation, and I hope to see you again at the next workshop.